Good evening, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this evening, and welcome to this evening's event, Campaign Against Arms Trade at 50, Adapting Resistance to a Changing World. So my name is Luc Brunet. I'm here at LSE. I co-direct the Peace and Security Project at LSE Ideas. I'm also a senior lecturer in contemporary international history at the Open University. So I'll just kick off with a couple of housekeeping issues. First of all, barring any technical problems, this event is being recorded. Thanks. This event is being recorded and will be made available on LSE Library's YouTube channel afterwards. So if you ask a question and you prefer not to feature in the recording, please just let either me or a member of LSE Library know, and we can make sure that we edit the video accordingly. We also wanted to say that this event is hosted by LSE Library as part of a series of events related to its current exhibition, A Say in the End of the World, curated in partnership with Gareth Bryant, a PhD student at the Open University and LSE Library. The gallery will be open after this event, so please do have a look on your way out. It's just on the right immediately before the exit of the building. It's certainly well worth a look. And on display at the exhibition are some of the archives of CAAT. And LSE Library are the proud custodians of CAAT's archive, and LSE Library archivists Samantha Osman and Angèle David-Guillou are currently cataloging this collection. And it's open to everyone to come and look at it. So again, please do just get in touch with a member of LSE Library if you're interested in having a look. I also wanted to mention that there's an array of CAAT literature on the table at the back of the room. So after the talk, please do have a look and help yourselves. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Sam Perlo-Freeman, is research coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade in the UK. His current main focus is on UK arms exports and the political influence of the arms industry on UK government policy. His other areas of expertise include data on world military expenditure, arms industry and trade, and corruption in the international arms trade. He is also a fellow of the World Peace Foundation, where he was previously program manager of their project on global arms business and corruption. And he's also a senior associate researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So Sam will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So Sam, welcome to LSE. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Luc, and thank you to LSE Library for hosting this event and the exhibition that Luc spoke about. Thanks to Daniel for curating it and organizing tonight's lecture. We're really glad to have CAAT's archives at LSE Library, where hopefully, if they're not already, they'll soon be available for general public access for research and whatever other purposes. A couple of years ago, as we were moving into a smaller office, I spent many, many, many days in the old office digging through all our old papers and rubbish and so forth, and preparing what was, I thought, of interest for donation to the LSE so that they would become more widely available, which was a very interesting time looking back through all those old papers. So this year, Campaign Against Arms Trade turns 50 on November 14th, in fact, in what was a very different world, and not just in that there was no internet, no mobile phones, precious few computers, and a functioning welfare state. And I will talk about, in this talk, some of the ways in which the world has changed over that period, specifically in relation to the arms trade. I barely remember 1974, certainly not the great events of the day or anything that was going on at CAAT. We are, however, privileged to have in the audience CAAT's first two coordinators. And so if I get anything wrong about the early years, I'm sure that they will be very quick to heckle me. Please do, especially Albert. As I say, I'm going to talk about the way that the arms trade, the arms industry has evolved its nasty business over the years, as technology has changed, as geopolitics has evolved, and the way in which CAAT has developed over the years in our opposition and resistance to this deadly trade. As I said, it was founded 50 years ago. It was in the wake of a Middle East war involving Israel. So plus ça change in some ways, but in others, the differences between the situation then and now in the Middle East are far more relevant than the similarities, and also in how the arms trade interacted with that. What hasn't changed is war, is the ambitions of global powers and their willingness to fuel war and repression and even genocide to advance what they see as their power and wealth interests. That sadly, for all our efforts and those of many other organizations, has not changed greatly in the past 50 years. The arms trade, of course, is much older than 50. Keith Krause, in his seminal work, Arms and the State, in 1991, actually looks back at the history of the arms trade back to something like the 14th century, when the Flemish and the Italian city-states were leading the way in the production trade in the new military technology of cannons and sort of early artillery and firearms, and the different waves of technology that have developed since then, and who's been leading the way in the different technologies of death and its trade. The arms trade first became, I guess, a subject of serious public interest after World War I, when there was quite a backlash to what were then called, as they are still in some circles, the merchants of death. People like Basil Zakharov in the 19th and early 20th century had brokered arms to all and sundry with the help of massive bribes. Again, that's something that hasn't changed very much, and which was seen as one of the factors behind World War I. And that led to some of the early efforts by some governments to start very tentative regulation of arms exports. But World War II and its aftermath made for a massive expansion in the global arms trade. We had two rival superpowers fighting proxy wars, seeking to gain allies around the world, whether in newly independent states or in resistance movements, anti-colonial movements, seeking new independent states, or in existing states who were seeking to become again new players in this world order. We had two declining European empires seeking in their different ways to work out what was their new place in this world, to maintain their status as great military powers when they were far, far outshone in that by the two superpowers, and where the arms trade was a key instrument of that, both in trying to maintain influence and in preserving their own domestic arms industries. and making sure that they could keep on supplying the arms for the British and French armed forces. You had other countries in Europe that were rebuilding their countries, including their militaries, and in some cases, their arms industries. And we had the Middle East, where the creation of Israel led to what was then known as the Israeli-Arab conflict, which in its different forms obviously has continued to this day and will sadly likely continue for quite a long time to come. And with the massive expansion of oil resources in the Middle East, leading to billions of dollars sloshing around in the pockets of these dictators who were looking for things to spend it on, buying arms to maintain the stability of their own regimes and to fight local feuds, whether with Israel or with each other, rivalries over control over territory, oil resources, and so forth. And you had all these arms producers, the US, the USSR, Britain, France, and others, more than willing to supply that demand. So in 1974, a number of peace organizations, they included CND, Peace Pledge Union, I think probably the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Quakers, so both religious and secular organizations, they all decided that the arms trade was, so the conventional arms trade was something that needed attention, but it wasn't any of their primary focus. And so they decided to set up a joint campaign, a coalition, if you will, called Campaign Against Arms Trade, to carry forward their joint work. So initially, and for a long time, CAAT was not an organization in its own right. It was a project, a joint project of these sponsoring organizations, though it quickly evolved a life of its own long before we became formally a separate organization, cutting the apron strings, if you like, with the sponsoring organizations. So it was in the wake of the Yom Kippur War in particular that CAAT was founded, where Israel had fought against Egypt and Syria and a coalition of Arab states. For the most part, the US armed Israel, the USSR armed Egypt and Syria, but many of the European powers were also arming Egypt. The UK sold arms to Egypt in the very year of 1973 of the war, and many of them were selling arms to various of the other Arab states in the coalition arrayed against Israel. So it was very much the case that the UK, France, the US were arming both sides of that war. And so I guess that this was seen as, well, something that ought to be stopped, frankly. And it still is. I don't know what was in the minds of the founders back at that time. On the left, generally, there was more sympathy for Israel than there is now, and less understanding of the position of the Palestinians. But I don't know how, maybe Albert knows and Sandy know a bit about this, about how the people who started CAAT saw that conflict. But in any case, what was one thing that was certainly true was that we were arming both sides, and this was a bad thing. Since then, as I say, there's been huge changes in the world. The Cold War, of course, ended and gave rise to very brief, fleeting hopes of a more peaceful world order. Then we had 9/11, which changed the world again. and the global war on terrorism and the horrific Western-led, US-led wars that followed that. And then the rise again of superpower rivalry, the rise of China, which thankfully has not yet led to war, and the re-emergence of Russia as a major power, and the start of the Ukraine war really in 2014, prior to the full-scale invasion of 2022. And with that, the nature of the arms trade has changed. Who is selling what to whom? And of course, the technology has changed. The structure of the industry has changed. As I say, during the Cold War, a large part of the arms trade, not all of it by any means, but a large part was about superpower rivalry. The US armed Pakistan, the Soviet Union armed India. Mind you, so did Britain. The US armed Iran, the Soviet Union armed Iraq. That was until the fall of the Shah, of course. The US armed Somalia and the Soviet Union armed Ethiopia. Or was it the other way around? What I do know is at some point when the regimes changed, they switched. So they both armed one side or the other at different times. The end of the Cold War changed that. One big change was there were far, far fewer interstate wars in the 1990s and the 2000s. The US-led Iraq war and Iraq-Kuwait war in 1991 was one of the exceptions. Far more internal conflicts, though very often with intervention from outside parties. And if you like, a much freer arms trade in terms of much less ideologically bound in terms of who was willing to arm whom. There was a big fall in military spending, both in the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, and in Europe generally, both East and West and in the United States. And this led to a consolidation of the arms industry to better be able to deal with the reduced demand from their main customers. It also led to a greater pressure to export to maintain those capabilities, as if you weren't in the United States, then domestic demand in the UK or France or Germany was not going to be enough to sustain these increasingly complicated capabilities. And they were becoming increasingly complicated. Mary Kaldor, who is, I believe, still of this parish in some capacity, pointed to the increasing elaboration and complexity of weapon systems in the Baroque arsenal. I think that was published in 1984. The fact that every generation of weapons was becoming more expensive than the last. I think that one military analyst calculated that if trends continued, then by 2050, the United States military would be able to afford one combat aircraft, but it would be a really, really good one. So these firms became fewer in number, larger, and more specialized in military technology, rather than, as many of them were before, doing a large mixture of military and civilian technology. The companies that do still straddle the two, it's in very adjacent areas. So Boeing still produced military and civil aircraft. Rolls-Royce produce engines for military and civil aircraft. Arms companies have gone into the security field, cyber security, and so forth. But generally, it's a much greater level of specialization. There have been new players arising in the arms trade, and I'll come on to some of the figures for this in a minute, as more countries have sought to develop their domestic industries. As they have advanced in technology, countries like South Korea, Israel, Turkey, they have also, of course, Israel has their own particular reasons for developing an arms industry as the primary tools of repression of the Palestinian people, and then exporting that technology of repression around the world. So it's become a more diverse arms trade in terms of which countries are involved in it, which also makes it a tougher nut to crack. You can no longer imagine that if you can somehow get the US and Russia and the Europeans to agree to restrict things, then that would end the arms trade. So I'm going to come to some look, just got a few slides here on some of the data looking over the years. I understood that if yeah, here we are. Oops, that didn't quite go. So this is SIPRI data on deliveries of major conventional weapons. It's not a financial measure, but it's the only consistent measure of the arms trade, which is a very non-transparent business that we have both over time and between countries. Why starting in 1969? Well, it's the year I was born, so that's a good year. But apart from that, SIPRI tends to deal in 5-year chunks. It had only recently started publishing data on the arms trade in, I think, 1969, 70. And so I'm imagining that those founders of CAAT in 1974, the most recent chunk of data they'd have been looking at would have been from 1969 to 1973. So as we can see, it's a huge rise through the 70s and early 80s. That peak there is, oh, it's not giving me the thing. I think it's 82, 83. It actually falls. The red line, by the way, is the 5-year average, which smooths out the sort of peaks and troughs that happen from year to year with big deliveries. It falls before the end of the Cold War, actually, in the mid to late 80s. I'm not quite sure exactly what was driving that, but then the end of the Cold War did considerably reduce demand. In particular, for example, the Eastern European countries were buying much, much less from Russia than they had been from the Soviet Union, for example. Then it sort of briefly rises in the late 90s. Despite everything that's going on in the world, the Iraq War, it's falling in the early 2000s. Before, of course, the US is mostly not importing most of its arms, they're making it themselves. So these are arms that are transferred from one country to another. But then, both as you've got more suppliers and as you've got increasing money to spend in a lot of the big buyers, formerly China, still India, the Middle Eastern countries, Japan, Australia as well, you've got an increase, a sort of steady increase in arms imports over the 2000s, somewhat flattening out now. That's the global picture. But who was doing it? Who were the exporters? So we've got here I've got looking at the first 10 years of that period, 69 to 78. That's the blue bars, and the most recent 10 years of data, 14 to 23. So back then, the USSR and USA were pretty much tied over that 10-year period for how much they were exporting to the world. And you have France and UK who's way behind, but clearly the next biggest ones. Germany, China, Czechoslovakia was a big arms producer when it existed. And Italy, and then these two, they weren't in the top 10 then, they're tiny amounts. So we can see in the most recent 10 years, the US is now absolutely dominant, even though it's exporting less sorry, I should be pointing at that, not that. That doesn't help very much. The US, Russia has fallen back massively compared to what the USSR was doing, though still the second biggest over that period. France is still well up there. UK's gone down a lot. I'll come to that. This seems really strange. I mean, it sort of looks from this like we're winning. If you look at that bar and how much it's gone down, if current trends continue, in 50 years' time, the UK arms trade will have worked itself out of existence. So we don't really need to do anything. But there's new players. I mean, China was always a major producer, but it's shot up in how much it's selling. Czech Republic's disappeared, literally. And here we have Italy, Israel, and Spain, especially the latter two, have shot up. They're some of the major players. And if you look a bit further down the list, you'd see South Korea and Turkey not far behind. And also, again, as I say, you've got a more diverse arms trade. Here, it's dominated by these two, and then France, UK, and Germany. Generally, apart from China, it's the Europeans dominated. Now it's much more a global trade, both in terms of who's selling as well as in terms of who's buying. And what about the United Kingdom? Here's the same sort of picture for the UK. And we see sort of some peaks and troughs over the 70s and 80s, some big blips, and then a really big drop as the Cold War ends and continuing to drop even into the 2000s. From CAAT's propaganda, you wouldn't think that the UK isn't really a big arms trader anymore. And from the government's propaganda, you wouldn't think that the UK isn't a big arms trader anymore. And that's one thing we agree on. So what's happening here? Well, remember, this is major conventional weapons. It's not a financial measure. And it is true that the UK seems to have fewer big customers for the big stuff, planes, ships, tanks, missiles, than it used to. And what we do sell a lot of is components, very important components. You might think widget, but a component can be the wings of an aircraft. It can be fancy electronic systems, which are absolutely crucial to modern warfare. And services. So BAE Systems has 6,700 employees in Saudi Arabia, maintaining the Saudi Air Force. We don't just provide the goods, we provide the after-sales service on hand in hand with the government. And BAE, if you look at their reports from the last 10 years or so, they've regularly been making at least £2.5 billion a year from Saudi, even when they haven't made major new deliveries. So none of that shows up in these figures. And that's why you can see UK sales of major conventional weapons falling, even as the government still tries to claim that we're the second biggest arms exporter in the world. In financial terms, it's probably third or fourth, but still a lot higher than it looks from this. Here's a sort of bit of a simpler picture looking at 5-year blocks. And then that red line shows with the right axis Britain's share of the world total. So again, you can see that declining quite a lot over the years. But who is the UK selling to? Again, we've got the blue bars are the customers back then in 69, 78 in total, and the red bars the most recent 10 years. So some is what you'd expect here. USA was the biggest, is still one of the biggest. Second in that decade was Iran. Oops. India, much less, there's much less to India then. I suppose there was still some sort of post-colonial relations going on, but now India looks elsewhere. It's still, Russia is still its main supplier. Israel is a big one. and US and France are increasingly getting in on the act. Saudi Arabia, of course, has shot up in importance. The UK has always had a fairly close relationship with the Saudi monarchy, as with the other Gulf monarchies, which you can read all about in David Waring's A Shameful Relationship on the table back there. But since the Al Yamama deal in the 1980s, Saudi Arabia has become regularly one of the UK's biggest, if not its absolute biggest, customers. Another big one that you might be a bit surprised by, back in the 70s, Argentina. Oops. That they, for obvious reasons, are no longer a significant customer. And some which, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how one explains what's gone up and what's gone down, but some of them have remained, like the Gulf states in particular, the US, have remained important customers. And really, I would say now, the UK arms trade is primarily, not entirely, but primarily to NATO and other close Western allies like Australia and to the Gulf, and not a whole lot to the rest of the world, which is not for want of trying. It's just that the French have been better salesmen than the British in recent years. That's all for data. So what has CAAT been doing about this over the years? Well, obviously trying to make the information available. As I said, it's a very non-transparent business. How am I doing for time, by the way? That's okay, that's okay. So just gathering the information, there wasn't an internet back then, so a lot was just from press clippings, from Jane's Defence Weekly, from the British Defence Equipment Catalogue and all that sort of such. We still have all the old editions in the CAAT office, which I mostly use to prop computers on, rather than for any other purpose. Just putting the information out there, whether in leaflets or in newsletters. It was a much smaller organization. For the first, I think, 10 years, there was only one staff member. I'm not sure when was it, Sandy, that there was first. You got your you said you got your second coordinator in 1980, right? Ish. Right. Okay. So yeah. And then it was, I think, 2 until round about the mid-90s, and it's really amazing what they did then in terms of both gathering the information and getting it out through one means or another. I remember back when I was a teenager campaigning against nuclear weapons in the 80s, and I saw an old CAAT poster about the amount that would be needed to cure world poverty and hunger, and that it was about the same amount as the world spent on arms in however many weeks. And that thought, yeah, that's an important issue too, I thought way back then when I hadn't heard the name Campaign Against Arms Trade. So it's really amazing how much they did with very few resources. I started getting involved in CAAT in the mid-1990s. CAAT had already been very active on a lot of the key issues of the times, whether it was arms to the South American dictatorships in the 70s. You can see Argentina and Chile were quite big on the list there. Again, there's some swag at the back about that. Ne Passerán, have you seen or heard of that film? If you've not, it's about some Rolls-Royce workers who were working on basically repairing jet engines, and they found out that the engines they were repairing were for Pinochet's Air Force, and so they refused to do it. And I believe that they were in contact with CAAT for sort of more details on all that was going on right back then. I think that was in something like 1974, so CAAT was 5, so CAAT was very new at the time. They were involved in campaigning against, of course, sales to Iraq and Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, which totally depended on arms supplies from outside. Very much involved in the process leading to the Scott report on arms to Iraq, when the UK was breaking its own arms embargo to arm Saddam Hussein. But when I joined, the big issue of the time was Indonesia and East Timor. In 1975, for those of you who don't know, Indonesia invaded its tiny neighbor, East Timor, which was just in the process of independence from Portugal, invaded and conquered it, annexed it, committed genocide. I believe the estimate of the number who died, both from direct massacres and from starvation and disease that inevitably follows, 183,000, and its population at the time of the invasion was 600,000. This invasion was supported tacitly and with arms by the US, the UK, and Australia. And in the mid-1990s, the UK agreed to sell Hawk trainer ground attack aircraft to Indonesia. Light aircraft, not your big F-16s, but they were exactly the sort of plane that Indonesia was using, whether it was American or previously supplied British Hawk planes, to try to quell the continuing East Timorese resistance in the mountainous inland of East Timor. I was made aware of this, like many people, by the incredible documentary Death of a Nation by John Pilger. And I was no naive Western supporting centrist or anything. I was a lefty and a peacenik, and I knew that our governments were bad and were not the good guys on the world stage that they pretended to be. But this blew my mind, that you couldn't both sides this one. You know, for a long time, people could say, well, you know, it's conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arabs, and they've been attacked, and terrorism and what have you. You couldn't both sides it. It was a very, very clear case of completely unjustified invasion and genocide, and we were on the side of the ones doing the invading and the genocide. And when they went through all the companies involved in it, in one bit of the film, it was all the big names of British manufacturing industry. Of course, BAE, British Aerospace was, GEC, Rolls-Royce, Lucas Aerospace, dozens of others of household names which you associate as great examples remaining of British manufacturing, and they were helping arm this genocide. As I said, you know, side note, the arms trade became much, or the arms industry became much more specialized, so you'd have much fewer of these household civilian names involved nowadays. So that's what first got me involved in CAAT in the mid-1990s. And it was a really pivotal time, I think, for CAAT. Interest in the conventional arms trade was growing, partly, I guess, because of the end of the Cold War. People no longer felt so threatened by nuclear destruction, so attention turned more to the conventional arms trade. There was this big issue of arms to Indonesia specifically, to focus attention. There was also the Scott report on arms to Iraq, as I mentioned, when Robin Cook famously eviscerated the government over the report after speed reading it in a few hours when it was released in Parliament. Of course, Robin Cook and the Blair government then sorely disappointed everyone in what they did on arms sales when they came in, though they didn't really surprise those of us who'd been watching. CAAT was growing in terms of its supporters and activist base and its staff. The staff team grew. We got our first press officer in round about that period. We started a research program, a dedicated research program. Of course, CAAT had always been doing research, publishing specifically information on the economics of the arms trade and trying to debunk the one big argument that was always raised and still is very often, but what about the jobs? What about the economy? We need the arms trade. And so presenting the facts and figures that debunked that sort of argument. And we got our first research coordinator, my predecessor, Ian, and we overlapped in the late 1990s. We were increasingly focusing on the arms fairs, like nowadays DSEI, which had its first incarnation in 1999, but there were other predecessor ones. And on those as a focus for drawing attention to and resisting the arms trade. And it was then that the CAAT supporters and activists increasingly embraced non-violent direct action as a means of resisting the arms trade. Most famously when the Seeds of Hope plowshares, Andrea Needham, Angie Zelter, Lotte Kvenlid, and my memory, who was the other one? I've forgotten. Anyway, you can look it up, broke into BAE Wharton and smashed up a Hawk jet that was bound for Indonesia and was subsequently acquitted by a jury. Sorry, sometimes these things get to me. I guess it's a good thing that they still can do. It was so that was a big development in tactics and sometimes led to conflicts within the organization between those who were more keen on that sort of direct action and those who embraced more traditional campaigning tactics, shall we say. It was also a time when the arms industry started heavily spying on us in a big way and started infiltrating CAAT with numerous spies as volunteers and even as, for a couple of years, our national campaigns coordinator before he was unmasked as a result of a whistleblower in BAE. It's interesting, though these spies did a lot of damage, both in the information they sent back to BAE and in the way that they stirred up whatever internal conflicts were going on within CAAT and exploited them. When the Seeds of Hope plowshares were planning their action, allegedly, in the, well, I don't need to say that, they were acquitted, in the garden of 11 Goodwin Street, our office at the time, the spies who were in the office at the same time had no idea. So whatever else you say about the Seeds of Hope, their tradecraft was pretty good. It was really quite a frenetic time. CAAT was very dependent on volunteers at the time. I was one of them in the CAAT office. I was running the Christian network. There were volunteers running the student network, organizing the arms fairs protests, helping with media and all sorts of other times, and sometimes sort of coming into the office late at night when the staff were gone and sending out press releases in response to revelations that had come out on that day. Later on, CAAT decided that exploiting free labor is probably not the way that we should be doing things. So I don't know, in some ways I lament the passing of those days, but I guess it was for good reasons. New issues have come up. We focused a lot on corruption. The arms trade is the most corrupt international trade business in the world. Our first big court case was when we challenged the government's decision to cancel the serious fraud office investigation into BAE Systems, who had paid, the SFO reckoned, about £6 billion in bribes to Saudi princes and generals and leaders as part of the ongoing Al-Yamama and then later Al-Salam arms deals. And just the most blatant example of how the government protects the arms industry from consequences. That 6 billion seems a lot, but BAE have got received about 88 billion pounds in revenue from the Saudi MOD since the 1980s. So yeah, from their point of view, money well spent. Saudi Arabia, of course, has been one of our biggest issues in recent years, with the horrific war in Yemen, where Britain and the USA have been providing all the aircraft and bombs and missiles used by Saudi to bomb Yemen. Thankfully, there's now a sort of tentative ceasefire there. Actually, now it's Britain and the US have taken over the bombing, so rather than outsourcing it to Saudi Arabia, but at least it's not quite as horrific as it was. And bringing us right full circle to when CAAT started, the big issue now is Israel and the fact that the UK is still supplying 15% of every F-35, which is one of the fighter jets supplied by the US that Israel's using to commit its genocide in Gaza. Again, that 15%, it's quite an important 15%. A plane won't take off, you may not know this, without its rear fuselage in place, which is one of the things that BAE makes for the F-35 in Lancashire. But that won't show up in any of these figures because it's not a major conventional weapon. I mean, this is not a failing of SIPRI, it's just if it was to try and track every single component, it would be an impossible task. So, of course, there's so much more one could say about the history of CAAT, but I think I'm pretty much out of time. So having brought things to a rather grim full circle, I'll stop, and I'm sure Luke has questions for me, and I'm sure many of you will have questions, but at first, if I may, like to just invite, I know I see many faces in the audience of people who've been involved over the years. If anyone just wants to add an odd reflection about your experience of CAAT and how it's changed over the years. And I see one hand in the air already.
Hello, I'm Valerie Flessarti. I'm from Pax Christi, and I was at the original meeting where we decided to focus on the arms trade. And Sam asked what was in the minds of the people at that meeting. I have three memories. One is that, yes, we agreed that the arms trade was an issue we were all deeply concerned about, but nobody was specializing in. And the focus for the meeting originally was that we wanted to know what to do with a coalition called DAT, Direct Action Training, because it was a dwindling thing. We were all nominally members for it, but we weren't sure what we were training in direct action for. So it was a chicken and egg thing. Did we need the issue for which we would be training, or do the training in order to find an issue? Anyway, the end of the day, the arms trade seemed to be the issue on which, as I say, we were all focusing, and rather not focusing, but wanted to. The person who I remember recommending or suggesting the arms trade, and we all said yes, was Bruce Kent. And one of the wars that would have been very much in his mind was the Nigeria-Biafra War, 1969. And he had seen at first hand the effects of British weapons being sold to federal Nigeria, which had really kind of motivated and galvanized him. And the third thing I wanted to mention, and I think these are all good things that CAAT has continued to do, was to focus on what government ministers were saying. And I remember particularly a saying of Dennis Healy's at the time, which was, Britain must secure its share of this valuable commercial market. And we quoted that a lot. And CAAT continues, and I think rightly, to shock us with what the people are saying, what's being said. But I think it's also interesting, and you alluded with, especially with DICE, to the direct action and non-violent actions that have become part of those protests. So it's quite interesting that that thread has been fulfilled. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name's Sagar. My interest is in supply chains, because for me, everything is about supply chains, whether it's my jacket or any other product. But when I looked at, probably the last 6-7 months, especially, well, before Palestine issues, but especially since, whether it's Syria, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Afghanistan or Gaza or any of these places, while everyone is looking at what's happening on the ground, my inclination is to look at and trace the supply chain of the resources of these, how do you say, the fighter pilots, all the military industrial complex products that are required for the military. And there's always one place I end up, because there's always going to be one source where all these minerals come from. And it's always in Africa. There's probably a few hundred miles north of Nigeria in a place called Congo, because 60% of the cobalt coal comes from Congo. But this is where it gets a bit more disturbing. What else are the resources that are coming from Congo used for? Not just for the fighter pilots or the helmets or everything. The reason why 30 American army bases are in Africa is because, and also the British and the French just got kicked out a few months ago, is because we're there to secure our interests, to secure and access the resources for the Green New Deal, for the solar panels, the wind turbines, the electric cars, all those minerals that we need so we can go green. So while we're here talking about the military industrial complex and all the resources, it's the same stuff. It's the same resources. My statement here is that for anyone who wants a Green New Deal and wants sustainability in the UK, you need the military in Africa. Without the military and the warplanes and all the control that's all over 1 billion people in Africa, the Green New Deal collapses. So the question here is, how much and what are people prepared to give up? If we want sovereignty and safety for, let's say, people in Africa or any other countries where these resources are people prepared to give up the Green New Deal? Thank you.
I think it's a very good. It's a very good point about the extractivism that's involved in Western and, well, great power relations with Africa generally. I think it's an oversimplification to say that without the military in Africa, you can't have a Green New Deal. The US isn't actually in DRC. It's a question of how these resources are got at, who's extracting them, who's profiting from them, who's getting exploited. And of course, it's the local people getting exploited and outside interests who are profiting. And not just solar panels, it's what we need for mobile phones. You know, every mobile phone has cobalt coltan in it, a large part of which comes from Congo. So I think the question is not, it's not that if there weren't the arms trade and militarism, then suddenly there wouldn't be any coltan. It's that we need to find a more just and sustainable way of actually getting what we need out of the ground, but doing so in a way that benefits the local people rather than the outside powers, whether it's Russia or Rwanda or the US, and the global corporations. So I don't think that's true, that the only way we can possibly get coltan is through force. There's lots of resources that are traded without the military force being the primary way of ensuring that that trade happens. It's about the terms on which that trade happens.
For the last 50 years. And if we're talking about sequestering carbon, this isn't about who's accessing the resources. This is about the fact that we are strip mining forests all over Africa so we can go green.
I think we should probably let someone else speak, and I think that your numbers are a bit dubious. But anyway, let's.
Oh, hold on. My
else.
numbers are a bit dubious, but this is a message from the global south. I'm the only ethnic here. Isn't it a bit trite that you're saying my numbers are dubious? We hold the resources, and you're saying this is accessible for you. No, it's not your resources to have. So what is this? Is this a new form of colonialism? The Africans don't agree with it. The BRICS are going to collapse everything that's been built up for the last 50 years. What gives? Is this the new form of colonialism?
It certainly is. I agree.
Yes, it is.
The
For the
way
Green New
that
Deal,
these
it's
resources are
colonialism.
got at is grossly unfair. I do not accept that it would be impossible to have trade in resources without.
That's not your view
fair
to have.
terms.
It's 1 billion Africans' views to have. It's our
And
views.
do you speak for 1 billion Africans? Do you speak
Better
for?
than you
I
do.
think we should move to
Better
another
than
topic.
you.
I think you've had your say.
Where's the brown and black skins here? It's only me.
I'm Albert Beale. I was involved in some of the meetings that set up CAAT, and I was very pleased that Valerie gave some of the background of how CAAT came into being and why it came into being. Almost, it was just a convenient issue to organisationally in some ways. Didn't mean it wasn't an important one. I was also pleased that the Biafra War background was mentioned, because it was important for me as well when I got involved, because I, as a student a few years before that, had been involved in campaigning in my local peace group in Brighton at the end of the 1960s over the Biafra War. And that was something, as well as the Middle East, that was also one of the aspects of international conflict where the arms trade was important, that helped to illuminate the issue and make it important for me. Yes, when we started CAAT, the direct action angle was something that we started CAAT in order to be able to have a focused direct action. Although interestingly, one of the first direct actions I remember CAAT was going to be involved in was blockading some shipments of arms, maybe it was to Indonesia, at Sheerness docks in, must be, I suppose, the end of the 70s and the early years of CAAT. And in fact, I remember going down and reconnoitering it and borrowing the car of the guy who ran Howson's bookshop, and but then the political campaign and the lobbying won through, and the deal was stopped. We never did our direct action, and so one of the first significant direct actions we were going to do never happened. And I don't know how. I think there were some mixed emotions about that, in terms of, was it good that we stopped the sale that easily? Well, not easily, but you know what I mean. One other aspect of the kind of consistent, fairly consistent part of what CAAT did over quite a long time, which I think wasn't particularly highlighted in what Sam was saying, was some of our interventions with corporations and their AGMs. And that was always quite an interesting thing, because it was quite almost an enjoyable day out for some of the people who did it. For those who don't know, quite a lot of people around the campaign had individual shares in companies like British Aerospace, or BAE, whatever it was that year. And we would go along, as was our right, at the company AGM, and the AGM would be full of a few hundred people in their suits, who a small number of whom actually did run the company because they were the big institutional shareholders, and hundreds of what in corporate terms are small shareholders, in our terms, big shareholders, sort of people who inherited a few thousand shares here and there, who thought they ran the company, and then a bunch of us who had individual shares who had no influence at all other than by what we had to say on those occasions. And I'm glad to say there were occasions when we were able to seriously, thanks to the research of people like Sam in the CAAT office, we were able to seriously embarrass them by raising issues that they didn't want raised. And we were able to get coverage for issues in the media because of our interventions at AGMs. I mean, one of the things that was particularly valuable, and it's quite topical now, in fact, is that there was a guy called Andrew Feinstein who was who's written a book about the arms trade in recent years, who had been a South African, a white heritage South African, member of the ANC, involved in the changes in South Africa. But then once he became part of the governing system there, he realized how much corruption was in the arms trade, and he denounced it. And in the end, he had to leave South Africa, and he came to Britain and joined work with the Campaign Against Arms Trade as somebody who knew the corruption from the inside. I remember he was one of us who would be doing our, on our feet, doing our little number at the AGMs. And in fact, he's standing against Keir Starmer in the general election this year. Just a little plug for anybody who happens to be in that constituency. Anyway, so I just want to say that the interventions at AGMs were probably not ultimately as effective as some of us felt they were when we were enjoying them at the time, but they did have some impact. They were embarrassing. One of the main things that CAAT has done over the years, it may not have stopped all the trade, but it's made the arms trade an issue. When we started CAAT, the arms trade was probably not even an issue. It became an issue. At least it is now controversial. And, that in itself is a big thing to do politically in the world we live in.
Absolutely. And it's interesting about the AGMs. I've been at quite a few of those AGM protests in the past, organized one or two of them, where we both have the sort of shareholders asking questions and demos outside, and sometimes demos inside among some of the shareholders, combination. We don't do that anymore. Why? Partly capacity, but also, again, changing nature of the arms trade, some small victories, and changing reactions by the arms companies. So BAE Systems is obviously the big one. We still have quite a lot of shareholders, of supporters with one share in BAE Systems. And we used to annually have a big thing, both the asking questions and the protests at their annual general meeting. It was typically in the QE2 Centre in central London. So for one thing, they decided that they didn't like this happening, so they moved their AGMs to their HQ inside the Farnborough Air Base. So we can't really mount protests there, and it's hard to get people to. We do bring shareholders again there to ask questions, but again, they've changed up. They've wised to our tactics, and they bring in a load of employee shareholders to give them softball questions. So we get a few in, but they're also prepared for them and better at answering them. So basically, when it comes to BAE, it's no fun anymore going to their AGM. And as for some of the other companies, well, again, before there was a lot of mixed civilian military companies. So we could say, look, why don't you diversify and focus on your civilian activities? Well, that doesn't happen so much. We're not going to persuade the likes of BAE that actually the arms industry is not really the best thing for them, because that's their entire business. And one of the things we did is to embarrass some of the big shareholders who really shouldn't be having shares in these companies, like the Church of England. Problem there is we won. We used to organise the Christian Network, the protests at GEC AGM, but then GEC merged with BAE. The Church of England got rid of their shares in them and other arms companies. The churches aren't in the arms companies anymore. So that's another reason for going to the AGM's gone. I think to some extent what's happening now, what PSC and War and Want, and CAAT's been supporting that in the last couple of weeks, is focusing not on the arms companies themselves, but on the financiers, the shareholders, the logistics companies. So there's a huge protest at the Barclays AGM recently by those organisations. So that's my suspicion. It was an incredibly important part of our campaigning. But I rather think that the days of going to the arms companies' AGMs to try to embarrass them, they're beyond embarrassment and they know how to deal with us there, may be past, they may come again, but it's focusing on these support companies that may be the way to go.
Hello, I'm an activist for London CAAT, so clearly I support the work of CAAT, but I would like to address what our participant earlier said. Before that, I did notice that as part of your presentation, you focus on the trade aspect of the arms, but don't include sort of like the political reasoning behind it, you know, because obviously global politics requires a whole other way of looking at it, but it's intrinsic in what we're trying to do by stopping the arms trade. And so sometimes it would be useful to be more explicit about that. And in that respect, obviously agree that the arms industry is being used not only to arm despotic leaders, but also to secure our economic, as we've, you know, resources, as has been said, and including now in the Gulf, you know, the Suez Canal, and we've seen all of that, what the interest of the Western nations are in the Gulf area. But what I'd like to say is that I agree that we, as Western nations, you know, in terms of if we're looking at the future and the way towards a greener future, if we want to be equitable about this worldwide, we have to look at what are we willing to give up, but not in terms of, I don't know if it's the same terms of what you were thinking, but in terms of resources. I mean, we use tremendously far too much resource. That's what we've got to give up and be willing to give up, not go out there and say, what can we do to secure more resources? Because I think that's just the wrong way of looking at it. Otherwise, that will perpetuate this colonial perspective on the rest of the world. So we really do have to cut back on what we're consuming as a nation, as a Western nation.
So if you've paid attention to student activism in the past couple of months, you'll have seen that at quite a few universities across the UK and across the US and across a lot of other places around the world. There's been student encampments in support of Palestine and in support of the liberation of Palestine. At the London School of Economics, students occupied the building just across from the library for about a month. And they were doing that on the back of a report that students and staff wrote, which kind of exposed how this university finances and sends money to companies like BAE Systems and Adani and Airbus, Caterpillar, and 13 arms companies essentially. And yeah, we were kind of wondering what, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear from people who have been involved in campaigning against the arms trade for a long time as well. Like divestment in particular isn't a new idea. And I think it would be really great to hear from folks like from you all, and then if anyone from the crowd as well would be able to speak about any advice you have to students that are really trying to make this work. But then also, there are questions that are posed to students constantly as like these links are exposed to egregious activities in terms of crimes against the Palestinians, arms companies, fossil fuels, about whether or not divestment is a reasonable ask, if it's effective, or if you should just engage. And so it's just it would be really great to hear from folks on their thoughts and advice and expertise as well. Do you have anything you want to?
Yeah. Just that a lot of the questions that we get asked do tend to come from people who are, you know, they're on the board of LSE, but then their main business is, you know, one of the companies that we've like outlined in the report. So the question's like, oh, well, if we divest from BAE Systems, is that going to harm UK security? And it's like, well, surely as a university, shouldn't be our main objective. But yeah, those are the kind of questions we get asked.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll take a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Come back for comment.
Thanks very much. I'm Simon Barrow. I was on the steering committee of CAAT from 1976 to 1985, representing Christian C&D. And just mentioning that, you mentioned the Church of England not being involved directly in investment in the arms trade. That's true. However, the wholly owned corporation that owns Church House, Westminster, which is the headquarters of the Church of England, has been used for a land warfare conference on several occasions, although next week's one has been cancelled, but just to mention that. But the thing that I was actually going to raise, since I'm involved a lot in trade unionism at the moment, is that a really important moment for CAAT was 1976, when workers at Lucas Aerospace, who thousands were going to be made redundant as a result of industrial restructuring through technological change, produced, of course, their famous corporate plan, which looked at how to shift from military production to civilian production, and also economically how to balance projects which would have produced some level of profit for the company with others that required subsidy. And that, you know, the campaigning around alternative production was really, really important. And actually, there might be a link there to divestment as well. That's a larger question. I wouldn't presume to give advice to those who are campaigning today, but it's really great within this meeting that we form that intergenerational link. But my question coming out of that, Sam, about the question of profitability and who makes money out of the arms trade, certainly during the 1970s, one of the kind of arguments for it was that arms sales helped to keep company production runs going when they would otherwise have fallen short. And also that there was the question of the unit costs of production for equipment for our own use and so on. But there were heavy also levels of subsidy. Of course, the Defence Sales Organisation, set up in 1966, becoming the Defence Export Services Organisation, there were actually very large amounts of public money going into the arms trade, but the extraction was from the private companies who were doing it, which is a kind of interesting foreshadow to what happened after the 2008 crash, when huge amounts of public money have actually gone into banking and financial institutions to keep them going. But I wanted to ask you that question about, you know, where are the profits being made now, and how is that structured compared to those earlier days?
Can I? Okay, I've got two questions. One is, what was the impact of the International Arms Trade Treaty that we all campaigned on so hard and got so many signatures, and it happened, but what was the impact? And I guess the second is, it's a big question, but I'll try and keep it brief, is in the aftermath of, or the ongoing confrontation, particularly in Ukraine, where does that leave our campaigning now? Because the realists are arguing, of course, that we left ourselves weakened by not spending in NATO, and we're up against a fascist dictator who then took advantage. So the argument is that we, you know, good fences make good neighbours, and that we should have kept up our military spending. So I just wonder if you could address that issue about campaigning going forwards.
This is just an observation. It's probably connected to what you're saying as well in the previous. I've been brought up to oppose all wars. The political reasons have been obviously from my parents and my family, and we're all the same, is that why do we have wars? And that's a big question. And what is the consequences? If you observe, I marched against the Falklands War, but I've been looking at the Iraq War. They had their own government, they had free health, etc., etc. Iran's got the same. They control their own way of living and what they do. And yes, there's political issues, but every war that I can think of it's because, in my opinion, the capitalist system has to have resources and markets. And therefore, whatever they do, they're looking for a profit. And our health service at the moment is full of that profit motive. But the way to educate the population about where this money's been spent, where the money comes from in the first place, which is usually the citizens of a country, and also what's the outcome. And once people understand that war and armaments does not make a better life for the majority, and all governments, I believe at the present time, are controlled by big monopoly capitalism. Just one more thing, you've got to get the people on the side. There's one way when they understand.
Yeah, so I'll try to come back to as many of those points as I can. So one thing, sort of linking first to those questions and comments and the last, the sort of struggle to get resources, the system of capitalist exploitation. And yeah, I think one thing I'd like to talk about more is how we understand the arms trade. It is not a thing in isolation. It is part of a global system of capitalism, colonialism, extractivism, of racist and imperial hierarchies within and between countries. And essentially, you can't end the arms trade just by opposing the arms trade on its own, which on the one hand makes it seem a much more difficult challenge, which it is. But on the other hand, it means that we are not. I think that for a long time, CAAT saw itself as part of the peace movement, which it is, but it is also part of a global movement for justice, for a different way of organizing the world economy and society and politics. We focus on this particular very important part of the global machinery of capitalism and of imperialist domination, but we are part of a network throughout the world that are focusing on different aspects of this machine, and we succeed together or not at all in many ways. Congratulations to you at LSE and all the other universities. It is fantastic to see these movements sprouting spontaneously and with support from existing movements all across the country, all around the world, in support of Palestine, against the arms trade, the companies investing in it and making these connections. In terms of advice, I mean, I've done my share of frontline campaigning, but basically I'm a researcher, so I can help with providing the information, but there's others who are better placed to give advice on, how not to get arrested. We do things like know your rights training and that sort of thing. Investments, what effect would it have divesting? It's not nothing. I think, universities divesting from BAE, they're not going to end BAE, they're not going to end the arms trade, but they're part of putting pressure of reducing the financial support base for the arms trade. They're part of delegitimizing the arms trade. For all that its main dependence is on government support and permission to operate, it also very much seeks a public license to operate. They get themselves into schools, into universities. They like to sponsor pride parades. I saw just recently BAE was nominated for some LGBT plus award for how wonderfully they treat their employees of different sexualities and gender identities. So you know, tackling them and opposing them wherever they rear their ugly head and denying that legitimacy, that public license to operate, I think is one important way. Yeah, the Lucas campaign, the Lucas plan is a fantastic initiative, and it was really huge missed opportunity. It wasn't taken up. There are efforts to produce sort of new Lucas plans to look especially at the transition to green energy as a source of alternative employment, both for fossil fuel workers and for arms workers. There is enormous demand. It's not going to be a shortage of potential jobs. Who's making the profits? The arms companies are still profiting very well. You could say they're making out like bandits. The UK arms procurement system is broken. If you're interested in the UK military having good kit at reasonable prices and on time, then the arms industry is not delivering that, quite the opposite. But however much they fail, they are rewarded for that failure, which is, I think, something of a national pastime in this country, rewarding large corporations for failure. This argument about unit costs and production runs, especially the latter, as I say, when you're producing these incredibly complicated, overcomplicated pieces of equipment and technology, if you're not keeping on producing them, major combat aircraft, nuclear submarines, and so forth, you forget how to do it. And it becomes more expensive and complex to try to do it again. Nuclear submarines, if we forget how to do that, good. And, you know, I think I wouldn't call myself these days a pacifist completely. Coming back to Ukraine, I don't think we can say that I do think Ukraine needs to defend itself. But really, if you look at Europe, even if you forget the US, which you really shouldn't, even if Trump were to pull all the troops out of Europe, the combined military spending, the combined military forces of the now even further enlarged NATO, the combined population and economic resources of these countries is, you know, a dozen times that of Russia. The idea that we can't possibly defend ourselves without spending more and more. But Britain is not interested in defending itself. It's interested in enforcing its will on countries in the Middle East. It's interested in sending off aircraft carriers around the world as status symbols to show the Chinese what's what. The Chinese are probably laughing at that, because you know, the UK aircraft carrier group is not going to make a blind bit of difference in the Pacific, and in maintaining this nuclear arsenal, which is at the very best a completely useless waste of money, and at worst, well, we'll know what at worst it could be. So it's a question of, if we do, thinking about what we actually need for genuine defense, if we're going to continue in Britain, in Europe, to have military defense, at least in the foreseeable future. What's actually needed for that? Not the grand status projects. And how do we do it without, in a way that's, that doesn't pour vast quantities of money into these companies to produce these baroque, ultra gold-plated systems that don't work. The aircraft carriers are all being repaired right now, and which are many years late. And maybe we don't keep all the capabilities that we had, but maybe we don't need all those capabilities to be able to stop Putin from overrunning Europe. And what else was there? The ATT. That was, I mean, came about because of the actions of organizations like CAAT and Amnesty and Oxfam that later got in on anti-arms trade campaigning, because the Labour government was so embarrassed with what was going on. It was, and a lot of organizations like Amnesty and Oxfam were saying, we need a global arms trade treaty. And so Tony Blair, who was really unpopular with his party, with the NGO world because of Iraq, decided to try and get a bit of that cred back by saying, yeah, okay, let's do that. And so the UK then was one of the leaders from the major arms producers of the charge for an ATT, brought the NGO community, except CAAT, along with them. CAAT was always skeptical of it. And so the ATT was negotiated and signed in 2013. We were skeptical because we knew that Tony Blair and the other major arms producers had no interest in actually doing anything that would seriously restrict the arms trade. They had no interest in stopping these huge multi-billion sales to Saudi Arabia. In fact, they were absolutely dedicated to making sure they go ahead, even if it meant trashing the UK's anti-corruption reputation, as I talked about earlier. So it was a way of legitimizing the arms trade, of making rules which, like the UK and the EU's own rules, look good on paper, but which are so open to interpretation by design that in practice they allow governments to do whatever they want to do. And a lot of the NGOs who'd supported this process felt pretty disappointed at what came out at the end. That said, the ATT is not worthless. For one thing, it's led to a lot of the smaller countries signing them who never had proper export control or stockpile management control systems, getting them in place, getting support for actually making them work. So that's a small, and maybe not so small thing. And the other thing is those words are there on paper. Even if the governments don't mean them, they are a standard by which to hold them to account and say, you have signed up to this, this is not what you are doing. And it's even potentially, and it has been a basis on which to bring court challenges. Our challenge to arms to Saudi Arabia was not based on the ATT, it was based on the UK's own laws, but many challenges that have been brought with varying degrees of success are based on the ATT. So although the ATT was signed with no intention by the signatories of making it mean what it says, others can try to make it mean what it says and hold the governments to account for what they have at least theoretically signed up to. So I think that's where we are with the ATT at the moment. It's a tool to use against the people who rather cynically brought it out in the first place.
Thanks very much, Sam. So it's gone 8 o'clock, so I'm afraid we'll need to leave it at that. But thank you, Sam, for a fascinating and illuminating presentation and for a lively discussion. Thanks to everyone.
Your contributions.
So before leaving, just a couple of quick reminders. Please do feel free to visit the exhibition on the way out. It's just to the right of the exit. Please also help yourselves to some of the literature at the back of the room. And for anyone interested in accessing the archives of CAAT, please do speak with a member of the library staff or contact them afterwards. And now, before leaving, please join me in thanking our speaker one last time.